The fire had been burning for 19 nights inside the snow, and Edwin Vale was still alive. Outside, 3 trappers lay frozen in cabins that had become their tombs when the blizzard buried the mountain pass under 20 feet of powder that refused to stop falling. Before we go further, let us know where you're watching from, and if frontier survival stories like this grip you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow's tale is even more impossible than this one. The first snow came to the Medicine Bow Range on October 12, 1839, 3 weeks earlier than any trapper in the territory expected. Edwin Vale stood outside the log cabin he shared with Robert Kincaid and watched fat flakes drift down through the pines. The sky had that peculiar yellow-gray color that meant serious weather, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees since noon. Edwin had seen early snows before during his 6 years in the Wyoming mountains, but something about this one felt different. The lomond deo minomond tended here. Flakes were heavy and wet, the kind that accumulated fast and stuck to everything they touched. Robert emerged from the cabin carrying his rifle and possibles bag. He was heading to check their northern trap line, a circuit that took most of a day to complete. The line ran along Badger Creek 5 miles from their camp and held a dozen beaver sets that Robert had placed 2 weeks earlier. Edwin suggested waiting until the weather cleared, but Robert shook his head. They had already lost 3 days to rain the previous week, and beaver season was short. Every day mattered when you were trying to make enough money to survive until spring. By evening, 6 inches of snow covered the ground. Edwin kept the fire burning in their stone fireplace and prepared a stew from dried venison and wild onions. Robert should have returned by late afternoon, but the snow might have slowed him down. Edwin wasn't worried yet. Robert knew the mountains, knew how to handle weather, knew when to push, and when to hole up. The trappers in this territory called him steady, which was high praise in a profession that killed careless men with brutal efficiency. Day 2 brought another foot of snow. Edwin woke to silence, the peculiar quiet that came when snow muffled every sound in the forest. He cleared the area around the cabin door and checked their firewood supply. They had enough split logs stacked under the eave overhang to last 2 weeks if they were careful. He expected Robert to appear any moment, trudging through the drifts with beaver pelts over his shoulder and a story about waiting out the storm in some sheltered spot along the creek, but Robert didn't appear. Day 3 delivered snow that fell so thick Edwin couldn't see the tree line 50 yards from the cabin. The accumulation reached past his knees in the open areas, waist deep where it had drifted. Edwin spent the morning splitting more wood, keeping busy, telling himself that Robert had found shelter and was waiting for a break in the weather. Mountain men survived by being patient and smart. Robert was both. By nightfall on day 3, Edwin admitted something was wrong. Robert wouldn't stay away this long by choice. Not in snow like this, not without supplies or proper shelter. Edwin checked his rifle, gathered rope and his heaviest coat, and prepared to search at first light. The storm continued through the night, wind driving snow against the cabin walls in waves that sounded like sand hitting wood. Edwin didn't sleep. Edwin left at dawn on day 4, following the route toward Badger Creek that Robert would have taken. The snow had finally stopped during the night, leaving a landscape transformed into something alien and treacherous. Drifts reached 5 feet in some places, and the familiar trail markers were buried or obscured. Edwin used a long pole to probe the depth ahead of him, moving slowly, conserving energy. The temperature had dropped sharply after the storm cleared, and his breath came, out in thick clouds that froze instantly on his beard. He found Robert 2 miles from the cabin, at the bottom of a shallow ravine near a stand of lodgepole pines. The trees had accumulated so much snow on their branches that several had released their loads in small avalanches, and one of these had caught Robert as he passed beneath. The cascade of snow and broken branches had knocked him off his feet and swept him 15 feet down the slope into the ravine. Robert had survived the initial fall. Edwin could see where he had tried to climb out, clawing at the steep bank, but the snow was too loose and the slope too slick. Trapped in the bottom with darkness coming and temperature plummeting, Robert had frozen to death sometime during the night. Edwin used his pole to climb down into the ravine. Robert's body was rigid, dusted with fresh snow. his face peaceful in a way that suggested hypothermia had taken him quietly at the end. Edwin sat beside his partner for several minutes, not praying exactly, but acknowledging the silence and the cold and the simple fact that the mountains had taken another man. He and Robert had shared 2 seasons together. They weren't close friends, but they were reliable partners, and that counted for more than friendship in this country. The ground was frozen too hard to dig a proper grave. Edwin used his knife to mark a tall pine nearby, carving Robert's initials and the year into the bark. He covered the body with rocks and branches, the best he could do until spring when the ground would thaw enough for burial. Then he climbed out of the ravine and stood at the top, looking back at the place where Robert Kincaid's story had ended. The walk back to the cabin took 3 hours. Edwin's legs ached from breaking trail through deep snow, and his mind worked through the mathematics of survival. Robert had been strong, experienced, and careful. He had died anyway, not from any mistake or poor judgment, but because he was in the wrong place when snow fell from a tree. The randomness of it was what struck Edwin hardest. You could do everything right and still die because nature decided your time was finished. That night, alone in the cabin with the fire burning low, Edwin realized something that would change everything. Robert hadn't died from the fall or even from the cold directly. He had died because he couldn't reach shelter. The cabin was only 2 miles away, warm and stocked with supplies, but it might as well have been 200 miles. Distance didn't matter. Access mattered. And when snow buried everything, access disappeared. Edwin spent the following week completing Robert's trapline circuit and processing the few beaver pelts he found. The work kept his hands busy while his mind circled around the same problem. Every trapper he knew lived in a log cabin built the same way for generations. 4 walls, notched corners, shake roof, stone or mud fireplace. The cabins worked well enough most of the time, but they had a fundamental vulnerability that nobody seemed to question. They required you to reach them. A cabin door buried under 6 feet of snow became a tomb entrance. You could dig out from inside if you had tools and strength, but what if the snow kept falling? What if you exhausted yourself digging only to have the entrance buried again by morning? And once you were trapped inside, your firewood supply became a countdown to death. When the wood ran out, the cold came in. Edwin had heard stories of trappers found frozen in their cabins, surrounded by furniture they had burned, trying to stay alive one more day. He started sketching ideas on pieces of bark using charcoal from the fire. Most were useless, the desperate thoughts of a man trying to solve an impossible problem. But one idea kept returning, persistent as winter itself. What if you didn't build shelter from wood? What if you built it from snow? Edwin had heard stories from French-Canadian voyageurs about snow houses used by native tribes in the far north. The stories always sounded like exaggeration, shelters made of blocks cut from drifts, warm enough to live in for months. Most trappers dismissed such tales as fantasy or lies. Snow was cold. Building a house from cold to stay warm made no sense. But Edwin kept thinking about the principle underneath the stories. Snow was an insulator. Animals burrowed into it. Ice caves stayed warmer than the outside air. What if the stories weren't lies but observations of something real? He began experimenting during his evening hours. He packed snow into a wooden bucket and let it freeze solid, creating a block. He stacked blocks outside the cabin, building a small wall. The blocks held together if he packed loose snow between them and let it freeze. The structure was crude and would never support weight, but it proved snow could be shaped and joined. The problem was scale and technique. Building a proper shelter from blocks would take days of work and require skill he didn't have. But there was another way. Instead of building up from blocks, what if you built from a pile? Heap snow into a mound, let it settle and freeze into a solid mass, then hollow it out. The structure would be self-supporting, the dome shape distributing weight naturally. The walls would be thick enough to insulate, and if you built it right, there would be no weak points where collapse could start. Harrison Reed stopped by the cabin in late November and found Edwin outside with a shovel, piling snow into an enormous mound in the clearing. Harrison watched for several minutes before speaking. "You building a snow fort, Vale, expecting an Indian attack?" Edwin didn't answer Harrison's question directly. He kept shoveling snow onto the growing mound, working methodically, building the pile in layers that he packed down with the flat of his shovel. Harrison watched from horseback, his expression shifting from curiosity to confusion to something like concern. After 10 minutes of silence, Harrison spoke again. "You feeling all right, Vale? Since Kincaid died, I mean." Sometimes losing a partner does things to a man's mind. Edwin stopped shoveling and leaned on the handle. "My mind's fine, Reed. I'm building winter shelter. You've got winter shelter. That cabin right there. That cabin requires me to reach it. Snow buries the door. I'm trapped or dead. I'm building shelter I can access, no matter how much snow falls." Harrison looked at the mound, which had reached 4 feet high and 8 feet across. "You're building a pile of snow. I'm building a dome. When this settles and freezes solid, I'll hollow out the inside. Smooth walls, rounded ceiling, entrance tunnel at the base. Snow insulates. Dome shape prevents collapse. I can keep a fire inside without the structure melting." Harrison stared at Edwin for a long moment. "You planning to live in this? With a fire? Inside snow?" "That's the idea. That's the craziest damn thing I've heard in Rizone. 20 years of mountain living." Harrison shook his head slowly. "Snow melts Vale, fire melts snow. You light a fire in there, the whole thing comes down on your head. Not if I build it right. There's no right way to do something impossible." Harrison gathered his reins. "I'll tell Bowen and Moss about this. They'll want to see the snow fort. Might bring whiskey. We could use entertainment." Arthur Bowen and Frederick Moss arrived 2 days later, both grinning like they were about to witness the best joke of the season. Edwin's mound had grown to 6 feet high and 10 feet in diameter. He had stopped adding snow and was now waiting for the pile to settle and cinder, the process where snow crystals bonded together under their own weight and pressure. Bowen walked around the mound, shaking his head. "This is what you're doing instead of trapping? Building a snow pile?" "It's not a pile. It's a structure." Moss laughed. "It's children's play. My boys build these in the yard. You, defending your snow fort from attacks, Vale? I'm preparing for the next big storm. When it comes, my door won't be buried. When it comes, you'll be inside a collapsed snow pile with wet clothes and no fire," Bowen said. "Snow and fire don't mix. Every child knows that. Every child knows what they've been told. Doesn't make it true. You going to teach us about snow now? I've lived through 30 winters in these mountains. Then you've spent 30 winters trusting cabin doors you might not reach. I'm building something different." Moss looked at Bowen. "He's serious. He actually thinks this will work." Bowen shrugged. "Let him try. When he shows up at my cabin half frozen, asking for shelter, I'll remind him about this conversation." Edwin waited 3 full days before touching the mound again. The temperature stayed below freezing, and the snow crystals in the pile were bonding, transforming from loose powder into a solid mass. This was the part nobody understood when they mocked his snow pile. Fresh snow was weak, vulnerable to collapse under its own weight, but given time and cold, snow underwent a metamorphosis. The crystals developed bonds between them, creating a structure stronger than the sum of its parts. The technical term was sintering, though Edwin didn't know that word. He just knew from experience that old snow was harder than new snow, and that patience made the difference between success and failure. On the 4th day, he began hollowing the interior. He started at the base, digging horizontally into the mound, creating an entrance tunnel that angled slightly upward. The tunnel was narrow, just wide enough for a man to crawl through, and he kept it low deliberately. Cold air was heavier than warm air. An entrance below the level of the main chamber would trap cold air in the tunnel, while warm air stayed in the dome above. It was a principle he had observed in root cellars and cave systems, and he was gambling that it would work in snow. As he dug deeper, he used his knife to shape the walls, creating smooth, rounded surfaces. This was critical. Rough walls had protruding points where stress concentrated, weak spots where collapse could begin. Smooth walls distributed force evenly across the entire structure. He worked slowly, checking wall thickness constantly with his knife blade, maintaining 18 inches throughout. Thinner would be too weak. Thicker would reduce interior space unnecessarily. The dome chamber took 2 days to carve. He worked from the inside, removing snow in small quantities, piling it outside, checking and rechecking the ceiling curve. The dome shape was essential. A flat ceiling would accumulate stress at the center and eventually collapse. A dome transferred force outward and downward to the walls, which transferred it to the ground. Every part of the structure supported every other part. There were no weak points if you built it correctly. The entrance was the exception. The tunnel opening was a vulnerability, a place where the structure's integrity was broken. Edwin solved this by installing reinforcement. He cut 2 straight pine logs, each 6 feet long and 4 inches in diameter. He planted these vertically on either side of the entrance, sinking them 2 feet into the packed snow and frozen ground. Then he laid a horizontal timber across the top, a thick beam that rested on the vertical posts and extended across the entrance opening. The framework created a permanent opening that wouldn't collapse even if snow accumulated above it. The logs bore the weight, not the snow structure itself. Frederick Moss visited while Edwin was installing the timber framework. He watched the process with his arms crossed. "Still looks like a simple snow tunnel to me, Vale. You spent a week building what my boys make in an afternoon." Edwin hammered the last support into place. "Your boys don't build to survive 3 weeks in a blizzard." The moment Edwin had been building toward arrived on a cold afternoon in late November. He had gathered firewood, organized his supplies, and prepared everything he would need for the test that would either validate his work or prove the skeptics right. He carried an armload of dry pine kindling into the dome through the entrance tunnel, crawling on his hands and knees. The interior was dark, except for the gray light filtering through the entrance. The curved walls rose around him, smooth and white, the air still and cold. He positioned the fire carefully in the exact center of the chamber, measuring distances to each wall with his arm span. 18 inches minimum clearance in all directions. He arranged the kindling in a small cone, added shavings from a piece of pitch pine, and used his flint and steel to strike sparks onto the most delicate shavings. The first spark caught. A tiny flame appeared, grew, spread to the surrounding kindling. Within minutes, he had a small fire burning steadily. Edwin sat back and watched. This was the critical moment. Every trapper who had heard about his project said the same thing. Fire melts snow. Snow collapses when it melts. Therefore, fire inside a snow structure was suicide. The logic seemed unassailable. But Edwin had observed something others missed. Snow didn't melt uniformly. It melted where heat concentrated, where surfaces were rough and absorbed energy, where water could drip and create cascade failures. His walls were smooth. Heat radiated evenly from the fire, warming the air, but the smooth surfaces reflected rather than absorbed. The fire warmed the chamber without creating hot spots on the walls. He watched the ceiling carefully. After 30 minutes, he saw the first change. The inner surface of the dome developed a thin glaze, a layer of ice forming where the warmth of the chamber met the cold of the outer snow. The glaze was subtle, barely visible, but Edwin recognized it immediately. The interior surface was melting microscopically and, in two-bopend, refreezing, creating a hard shell. This shell was stronger than snow, and it would protect the structure from further melting. He added larger pieces of wood to the fire, building it up slowly, testing the limits. The temperature in the chamber rose. He removed his heavy coat and sat in just his wool shirt, comfortable, warm, dry. Outside, the temperature was below 0. Inside, it felt like a cool spring evening. The fire burned for 8 hours. Edwin added wood periodically, maintained the flames, and monitored every inch of the walls and ceiling. No collapse, no dangerous melting. No structural failure of any kind. At dawn, he crawled out through the entrance tunnel and walked around the exterior. The dome looked exactly as it had the previous day. He went back inside and examined the walls. The glaze had thickened overnight, creating an interior shell of ice that armored the structure. He had done it. Fire and snow could coexist. The impossible was routine. Harrison Reed rode past that morning and saw smoke rising from the dome's ventilation hole. He stared but said nothing. The second major storm of the season arrived on December 4, 1839, and it came with a fury that made the October snow seem like a gentle introduction. Edwin woke in his cabin to absolute silence, the kind that preceded serious weather. By noon, snow was falling so thick he couldn't see the tree line 30 yards away. By evening, 6 inches covered the ground. By midnight, it was a foot. The snow didn't stop. Arthur Bowen secured his cabin on the second day, barring the door from inside and settling in with his supplies. He had 2 weeks of firewood stacked inside, dried meat, coffee, and flour. His cabin was solid, built 5 years earlier with careful notching and good chinking. He had survived worse storms. Frederick Moss did the same, confident in his shelter. Harrison Reed lived 3 miles east and made similar preparations. Across the territory, trappers retreated to their cabins and waited for the storm to pass. Edwin moved into his dome on day 2. He carried his essential supplies through the entrance tunnel using his wooden sled, making multiple trips. Firewood, food, water containers, blankets, his rifle, ammunition, and the few personal items he owned. The dome chamber was 12 feet in diameter with a ceiling height of 6 feet at the center. Enough room to stand, move around, and live comfortably. He arranged his supplies against the walls, established a sleeping area with his blankets on a platform of pine boughs, and built his fire in the center. Day 3 brought snow that fell without pause. Edwin woke to find the entrance tunnel partially filled. He took his long pole and crawled out, using it to probe ahead and clear snow. The work took 20 minutes. Outside, the world had disappeared into white. He gathered more firewood from the stack he had prepared near the dome, loaded it onto his sled, and pulled it back through the tunnel. Then he sealed the entrance most of the way, leaving a gap for air circulation, and returned to his fire. Day 4. The snow continued. Edwin's dome was now completely covered, buried under the accumulation, invisible from the outside, except for the small entrance and the ventilation hole at the peak. He maintained his routine. Each morning he dug out the entrance, hauled firewood, checked the structure. Each evening he cooked simple meals over his fire, ate and slept warm while the storm raged outside. The dome walls grew thicker as snow accumulated on top. The structure actually became stronger under the load, the dome shape distributing the weight perfectly. Day 7. A week of continuous snow. Edwin crawled out one morning and saw that Arthur Bowen's cabin, visible from his location, had smoke coming from the chimney, but the door was completely buried. The snow had drifted 8 feet deep against the south wall where Bowen's entrance was located. From inside, Bowen would be trapped. He could dig out, but the effort would exhaust him, and the entrance would fill again within hours. By day 10, Edwin had established a rhythm that felt almost normal. Wake with first light filtering through the entrance. Crawl out with his pole. Clear the tunnel opening. Assess conditions outside. Haul firewood on the sled. Return inside, seal the entrance partially, build up the fire, melt snow for water, cook breakfast. The routine kept him sane, gave structure to days that otherwise blurred together in the perpetual twilight of the storm. The dome performed beyond his expectations. The interior temperature stayed comfortable, around 40 degrees when the fire burned low, 60 when he built it up. The ice glaze on the interior walls had thickened to nearly an inch, creating an impermeable shell that prevented any melting of the outer snow layers. Condensation from his breath and the fire froze on the ceiling and walls, then sublimated away, maintaining equilibrium. The ventilation hole at the peak, kept open with his pole, drew smoke up and out, while the entrance provided fresh air. The system worked. Day 12. Edwin emerged to find the smoke had stopped rising from Harrison Reed's cabin chimney. Either Reed had run out of wood, or he had given up trying to maintain a fire while managing ventilation in a sealed structure. Smoke could back up into a cabin if the chimney was blocked by snow or ice. Carbon monoxide was invisible and deadly. Edwin had no way to check on Reed without snowshoes and half a day of travel through impossible drifts. Day 14. 2 weeks since the storm began. Edwin's mental state remained solid. The dome provided enough space that he didn't feel entombed. He could stand, pace, move around. The fire gave light and warmth. He had brought books and spent hours reading by firelight. At night, he lay in his blankets and listened to wind-driving snow against the outer layers of his shelter. The sound was muffled, distant, like listening to ocean waves from inside a cave. Arthur Bowen's cabin showed no smoke for 3 consecutive days, starting on day 15. Edwin noted this with growing concern. Bowen was experienced and tough, but being trapped in a cabin while a blizzard buried everything created impossible choices. Conserve wood and freeze, or burn wood and run out before the storm ended. Every trapper faced the same calculation. Day 19, Edwin crawled out into conditions that had finally changed. The snow had stopped falling. The sky showed patches of blue between gray clouds. The silence was profound, the world buried under a blanket that had transformed every familiar landmark into anonymous white mounds. Edwin stood outside his dome and looked around. His entrance remained accessible because he had maintained it daily. The dome itself was invisible under 6 feet of accumulated snow, marked only by the entrance opening and the barely visible ventilation hole. That night, he kept his fire, burning bright. The warm amber glow from the entrance was visible for hundreds of yards in the darkness, a signal that someone had survived, proof that the impossible wasn't impossible after all. On day 20, Leonard Price appeared, struggling through chest-deep drifts. Leonard Price looked like a man who had seen death and walked away changed. His face was gaunt, lips cracked from cold, eyes hollow with exhaustion. He collapsed near Edwin's entrance, unable to speak for several minutes. Edwin helped him into the dome, gave him water, built up the fire. Price sat close to the flames, shaking, his hands held out toward the heat, like a man worshipping something sacred. "My cabin," Price finally managed. Corner gave way. Snow came through. "I got out, but barely. Been trying to reach Bowen's place. Can't make it through the drifts." "How long were you out there?" 2 days, maybe 3. Lost track." Price looked around the dome interior, his expression confused. "This is it? This is what you built? The snow tunnel everyone mocked? This is it. It's warm, it's dry. There's fire inside snow." Price shook his head slowly. "We're all idiots, Vale. Every one of us." Edwin gave Price food and let him rest for several hours. Then they prepared to check on the other trappers. Edwin had snowshoes he had made weeks earlier, in anticipation of exactly this situation. Price had none, but was desperate enough to try moving through the drifts regardless. They headed toward Arthur Bowen's cabin first, a journey of less than a mile that took 2 hours of brutal effort. Bowen's cabin was buried. The door was under 8 feet of snow. No smoke came from the chimney. Edwin and Price spent an hour digging, creating a tunnel down to the door. When they finally broke through and forced the door open, they found Bowen inside, alive but hypothermic, wrapped in every blanket he owned. His firewood had run out 3 days earlier. He had burned 2 chairs and part of his table trying to protect it. Stay warm. When he saw Edwin and Price, he started crying. They got Bowen back to Edwin's dome, warming him slowly by the fire, forcing warm broth into him. He recovered enough to speak by evening. "I heard you were building something. Heard them laughing about it. The simple snow tunnel." "I laughed too. Most people did. I'm not laughing now." Bowen looked at the dome walls, the fire, the supplies Edwin had stored. "You knew. Somehow you knew this was coming. I knew cabins had a weakness. I built something without that weakness." They found Wallace Hyde 2 days later when the weather cleared enough for serious searching. His cabin was intact, but his door had been blocked. He had died trying to dig out from inside, exhausted himself, and frozen. Frederick Moss survived but lost 3 toes to frostbite. Harrison Reed had run out of firewood on day 16 and burned everything combustible in his cabin, including parts of the floor. He survived, but his cabin was uninhabitable. Elias Stone, the oldest trapper in the territory, came to see Edwin's dome after the storm ended. He walked around it twice, examined the entrance, looked inside. 43 winters, he said quietly. Never seen anything like this. Spring of 1840 brought change to the northern Wyoming territory. 6 trappers, including Leonard Price and Arthur Bowen, began building snow domes before the next winter arrived. They visited Edwin repeatedly, asking questions, taking notes, watching as he explained the principles. Some understood immediately. Others struggled with concepts that seemed counterintuitive. Snow as structure, fire as compatible with ice, patience as critical component. Not all the first attempts succeeded. Harrison Reed built a dome, but didn't wait for the snow to sinter properly. He hollowed it out after one day, and the ceiling collapsed while he worked inside. He survived but abandoned the project, declaring snow domes too dangerous. Frederick Moss built one, but made the walls too thin, only 10 inches instead of 18. His dome lasted through one moderate storm before developing cracks that spread and caused partial collapse. Edwin taught what he could. The sinter weight was mandatory, 3 days minimum in cold weather. Wall thickness couldn't be compromised, 18 inches throughout, with no exceptions. The entrance framework had to be solid, vertical posts set deep, horizontal beam properly sized. Fire positioning mattered, dead center, adequate clearance. Ventilation required constant attention. The hole at the peak kept clear. These weren't suggestions, they were requirements, and skipping any of them invited failure. Leonard Price built his dome exactly as Edwin instructed. He waited 4 days for sintering. He maintained 18-inch walls. He installed proper entrance reinforcement. When the first test storm arrived in December of 1840, Price's dome performed flawlessly. He sent word to Edwin afterward, a simple message, delivered by a passing trapper. Worked. Thank you. The winter of 1840 to 1841 brought storms even more severe than the previous year. 12 trappers across the territory were living in snow domes by then, some built well, others less so. The well-built domes saved lives. Men who would have died in buried cabins survived comfortably with fire and supplies. The phrase spread through the mountain communities, Vail's Simple Snow Tunnel. The name carried respect now, not mockery. Simple in materials, simple in concept, sophisticated in execution. Edwin left the mountains in 1843. The fur trade was dying, beaver populations depleted, markets shifting to other materials. He took his savings and traveled to Oregon Territory, bought land in the Willamette Valley, and started farming. He married in 1845 a widow named Catherine who had come west with a wagon train. They had 3 children. Edwin lived quietly, never speaking much about his trapping years. But in the high country of Wyoming and Montana, snow domes continued appearing each winter. Trappers, hunters, and eventually prospectors used the technique, modified it, adapted it to their needs. Some credited Edwin by name. Others had learned the method second or third hand and didn't know its origin. The innovation had become part of frontier knowledge, passed along like any other survival skill. Edwin Vail died in 1872 at age 58 on his Oregon farm. His obituary in the Salem newspaper mentioned his years as a trapper, but said nothing about snow domes or survival innovations. To his family and neighbors, he was simply a farmer who had once lived in the mountains. But in territories where winter could kill, his legacy remained carved not in stone, but in the smooth walls of snow domes that still stood each season, proving that what seemed impossible was simply knowledge applied with care. The simple snow tunnel had rewritten the rules, and dozens of men lived because one trapper refused to accept that cabins were the only answer. What they called simple had never been simple at all. It had been genius disguised as common sense, and it had saved lives across 2 decades of brutal winters on the American frontier.